Star Citizen's RSI Polaris exhibits a different kind of beauty than the kind of ships I've reviewed here before on an Architect Reviews, thinking of the 890 Jump super yacht you may have seen before. It's not about clean lines or delicate hull plating, but instead about the kind of beauty that some find in battleships and cruisers of yore. That kind of beauty that comes from seeing so much firepower come together in one efficient package. It's only one of the few times I've ever seen in memory CIG not just matching a concept art, but surpassing it. But it's not a pure success, with its interior at times falling a bit short in polish and detailing, where a little bit of extra iteration would have made some of the moments in there a little bit more memorable. So then join me as I take you on a full stem-to-stern tour of Star Citizen's largest combat-focused capital ship yet, where I'll show you exactly where I saw success and some room for improvement. If by the end you enjoyed this video and you want to continue supporting me so I can keep making such time-intensive videos like these, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button to show your support and maybe share with a couple of friends. Like in architecture, we're going to start our tour on the approach, going through the procession of the user like you might do in the real world. A place where the designer has the biggest opportunity to make a positive first impression and grab the user's attention, while also informing them what they should expect with the rest of the design and what the design is meant for. Here, there's nothing that I saw but pure success. From every angle, the Polaris has something interesting to draw the eye to, starting from its aggressive wedge silhouette suggesting power and speed, down to the hull plating that helps sell its scale from a distance in a way that I think other ships of its size haven't really done a good job of up until now. It's clear the artists took their time to consider every angle of the ship, so I've been hard-pressed to find a bad shot of it. And despite all of that detailing, what's really exceptional is that you can still read the shape language from afar, with the creases and lines that start from the bridge and make their way back towards the 6 engine cluster at the rear of the ship. The rear structural expression with its giant X and support structure also gives a very unique visual personality to the ship that's different than any other ship we've seen yet in the game. There's no mistaking then it for any other ship of its size. It also continues the RSI language that we've seen from other ships like the Constellation and the recently released Zeus Mark II with its outboard angular engine clusters. Zooming in on some of the details, there's also moments of success here. Starting at the back, the engines are phenomenally well detailed, even having a really cool startup animation where these louvers will actually actuate as the ship powers on. The fins that fold out also add to the aggressive, predatory feeling, helping sell its forward-facing firepower. A fitting gesture that complements its formidable firepower with a staggering set of 28 size 10 torpedoes. Just a single one of those, by the way, can one-shot a Hammerhead escort corvette, making staring down the sights of one of these ships quite a bit of a scary prospect. On the top of the ship is yet another big feature of the Polaris, a large, top-loading hangar bay capable of holding a complement of light fighters or a single heavy fighter. The complicated shape of the ship, though, necessitated a rather clever way of designing the hangar doors, which break down into several interlocking sections that fold upon themselves and then tuck away beneath the hull. The fact that they were able to get this to work on its own is quite a feat, and it's not even the only impressive active element on the design. The array of fins and engines transform and unfold when the massive landing gear are retracted after the ship takes off from a landed surface. The turrets also are highly embellished, being concealed behind articulated heavy blast doors. Going down below the ship, there's also 2 massive loading ramps that fold down from the ship's sides in a way that near equals the complexity of the top hangars. The team involved clearly put a ton of effort into this and their best foot forward. Any one of these details I discussed would have been a showpiece on their own for a ship design, but the Polaris, it displays several. And we're not even done yet. Traveling all the way forward to the unique forward-facing bridge reveals a bespoke primary turret. It sports size 6 weapons, but being bespoke, they do a bit more damage than regular size 6 weapons. What's really cool about it though is the way the gunner's platform gimbals with the weapon's direction, giving the occupant a better view of targets. Finally, on its forwardmost section, you'll find 4 tubes for the size 10 torpedoes that hide away behind armored blast doors when they're not in use. They're flanked by a bespoke set of missile tubes ready to deal a ton of damage, or better yet, to confuse or distract enemy PDCs when trying to get a size 10 to land home. And on that subject, it's worth noting that the Polaris also heralds in a new addition to Star Citizen that's honestly been a long time coming: automated PDC turrets capable of dealing with missiles, torpedoes, and even small threats. They make for an even better fireworks show when things really get cooking. Overall then, like I already said, the exterior is a home run. It's phenomenally well detailed with tons of great little moments on it that are worth your attention and focus. But now it's time for us to take a step on board and see where things maybe didn't work out quite so well, at least in my opinion. The Polaris has 4 main points of ingress and egress. After the hangar bay, which I've already shown, the Polaris enjoys 2 docking ports on either side of the ship's exterior along the edge. They're hidden behind some blast doors that can be operated by activating a docking sequence or by opening them manually. Next are the 2 port and starboard side loading ramps, which connect you directly to the cargo bay and vehicle bay. And finally, there's a personnel lift that you can find just forward of the massive forward landing gear on the Polaris. Have I mentioned how big the gear are, by the way? Both the personnel lift though and the ramps are a bit hard to activate, with you having to go out to where they'll end up landing after they've been opened, so they can be a bit hard and tricky to figure out, and it's definitely something that could have used a little bit more polish on the part of the designers. Perhaps they might have considered using a holographic ground projection like they did with the C1. The place that we're going to start our tour from is going to be the docking port though, as I suspect that the Polaris is probably going to see most people entering through the docking port where the ship is best suited to actually be, and that's in space with space engagements. On first entry, my initial impression is that of a bit of disappointment in a lack of drama for such an important entrance. While there's some embellishment with the RSI logo, the strong lighting and hatch pattern on the door to the left or to the right depending on which side you're entering on draws the eye away from where I think the artist really intended it to. Additionally, the color palette and lighting are a bit too monochromatic for my taste, with too little contrast. It also surprises me that there's no suit locker here for EVA maintenance, given that it's something that we've come to expect now based on other ships like the 890 Jump, the Hammerhead, the Corsair, and so on. The details, though, are excellent. It's just let down by the paint scheme and the lighting, and a lack of program consistency with some of the other ships we've already seen. Traveling to the top of the stairs just beyond the airlock reveals the main corridor of the Polaris, where RSI's angular language makes its debut in the form of dramatically angled wall surfaces. The gesture lands successfully, but is a bit let down yet again by a lack of contrasting color and interesting lighting. Interesting design elements like the expression of the structural ribbing on the ceiling goes without embellishment, while line lighting on the left side of the wall here doesn't look to have any justifying rule set for where it's showing up and why it appears. Again, like the airlock, I find myself impressed by the form and detail, but it ends up lacking on the execution for the final polish to celebrate the work that's been done. A look at the recent color scheme, for example, of the RSI Zeus Mark II interior, shows how color can play a really big role in giving a better reading of geometry and making the space just feel more successful. It surprises me then that this color scheme wasn't continued onto the Polaris. Traveling down the corridor, another issue also immediately came to mind, and that's wayfinding. There is a distinct lack of clear signage or character telling me the direction of key important program, leaving me to rely on a map system to navigate or memory if I've been on the ship before. An unfortunate crutch that really detracts from the experience overall. The result naturally is frustration, especially when you open a door onto, say, a maintenance room instead of a room that you were looking for. Looking a little closer, you may spot some signage in some locations, but its scale and the monochromatic paint scheme I talked about play against its reading and result in it being easily overlooked. Continuing the tour of this deck, our first stop is going to be the crew quarters. The most striking thing of all on entrance is the aggressively angled walls that even encroach on the headspace of the occupant. While the lighting here is warmer to create a more warm and welcoming feeling, the aggressive wall angles work against it to deliver a more strong feeling of claustrophobia. We'll revisit this in a moment, but first, let's step into one of the crew cabins. Each room features a double bed, toilet, and a seating area. A luxury to be sure on a ship of war, but not something I would demerit the ship's design for. The space here is well arranged with the area for rest and effective crew storage for crew articles of effects to put next to their bed or in 2 lockers that adorn the wall of the space. It's successful in my mind, but it strikes me how inefficient it is, given that the ideal crew complement probably exceeds the amount of available beds here according to some figuring by my community members thinking on engineering and all the occupiable stations. I think both issues here may have been addressed by considering an alternative tiered bed system like found on real Navy ships or even on the Idris or Javelin. Instead of a double-loaded corridor then, one side may have been more open with a series of more densely arranged bunk beds and a small area designated as a communal head, leaving the private quarters for officers and the last one at the very end of the hall for the XO, giving the executive officer their own bunk room that would be a little bit more bespoke. The only issue would be finding a place to put said head, but I think it could have been massaged given a little bit of time. I do like the plants though at the end of the hallway. It's nice to see a little bit of green on a military ship. Now though, let's step out another hatch at the end of the crew quarters, showcasing that the Polaris' layout is actually pretty well considered with many locations having multiple access points, helping to reduce bottlenecks for circulation, but more importantly, for gameplay because after all, this is a video game and you want to have a more engaging experience with less bottlenecks and more routes to objectives. The exit then takes us onto the main corridor of the ship that will eventually lead us to the bridge, which we'll visit towards the latter half of this review. But like the other parts of the hallway, the lighting and contrast of the color lets the space down quite a bit. Next though, let's step into the crew mess and recreation area. I like its proximity, by the way, to the crew quarters. It again suggests a good resolution of layout and program relationships. Like the Habs, the mess exhibits warmer lighting to enable better relaxation. In terms of form, I like that there's again an expression of structure within the space, reinforcing that you're within a bulky military ship. I like this reminder of the utilitarian nature of the RSI design language. I also like that there's two sunken relaxation spaces of different scale to allow for different types of social interaction and to break up the large open space into smaller, more intimate spaces. Once again though, the lighting and contrast makes an otherwise exciting space feel a bit more drab than it might otherwise be. I could see, for example, blue accent lighting behind the couch or beneath the stairs to contrast this warm lighting and bring a little bit more visual interest to the space. While these might seem like small details, the result can be more of a sense of relief. So when we're talking about design, we're not just talking about whether or not we think it looks good or bad, but about the general comfort and feeling of the occupant. I want to make sure that that's clear here. Next though, we return to the main corridor and travel aft towards our next stop, the Medbay. In terms of utility, the Polaris offers an impressive 4 usable medical beds that players can set as a respawn, making the Polaris a must-have for current org activities and probably those going into the future. In terms of design though, it suffers from a lack of interesting color scheme and lighting like the rest of the ship we've already seen. I also feel that some additional detailing and embellishment would have enhanced the space. Looking at examples like the Carrick's medical bay, which does a really good job of detailing the space, shelves and locations for scientific and medical equipment really sell that this is a space for medical use. I also think that noticeably brighter walls and lighting would have also helped further sell its medical nature. Traveling further aft though, we'll arrive at a weird interstitial space with a lift and stair access that will bring us eventually down to the engineering section of the ship. We'll visit that a little bit later. Of all the upper deck spaces, this one struck me as the least well resolved. There's a lot of open and unused space, which makes me think it might have been better to investigate how this space could be used for some missing program, like a briefing room, which would likely make a lot of sense for a ship of this size and a large crew complement. And of course, for the flight deck itself, which would probably have a different type of person on board, like scout pilots or marines for landing and boarding parties. It might have even been a staging area with a window out onto the flight deck to see the comings and goings of ships. It just seems like there's a lot of cool things they could have done here. Let's continue our tour though now onto the opposite side of the ship. Now opposite of the medbay is a reflected floor plan where instead of a medbay you'll find a brig. Yes, the Polaris finally has a brig that players can use and lock unsuspecting friends and foes in. On approach though, you'll find, just as with the medbay, that there's no clear labeling for this to be a brig and no color scheme to really separate it on the outside. But when you step through the doors, it's a bit of a different story. Here, the darker color and lighting scheme better suit the purpose of this program. The harsh grays and utilitarian design seem to fit for a place to house disruptors and criminals and unsuspecting friends. There's also a great addition to detail here with appropriately designed cells that contain a bunk and a toilet, but also a place to deliver food and drink when keeping the occupants safely inside and the door locked. I like this attention to detail, and I just wish it was followed up with the rest of some of the areas of the ship. Now though, I think it's time we visit one of the most exciting parts of this whole deck, and that's the hangar, which is one of the only spaces that's very clearly labeled. You can't miss it. It says Hangar 01 right on the door. Entering reveals a dramatic space with angled walls like we've seen throughout the RSI design language, and lighting that seems appropriately bright and dramatic, providing contrast and utility for pilots coming or going. The orange strip along the walls also provides a little bit of a better visual reading of the space's dimensions, while white lines on the floor help create visual anchor points for pilots to better position their ship. The raised platform along the sides also provides a safe walking area around the tarmac, which is also very tarmac-esque with its different texture. I really appreciate that attention to detail. Of particular note though are a series of blast doors that raise up from the ramps just in front of each access door, providing protection against boarders or just against blasts from ship engines. The air shield along the roof is also a very cool detail, and when ships intersect it, you can see a line cut across a ship. It's just a nice little science fiction touch that I really appreciate. Now though, let's check out some of those more successful interior spaces aboard the Polaris. The engineering deck. Journeying back aft down to the corridor we just saw a little bit earlier, we'll go down the stairs instead of the lift to visit an intermediate deck space that houses a number of the ship's important components, like the gravity core. The lighting here is far more successful and dramatic than we've seen anywhere on the main deck, with blues and reds positioned to complement angular geometry and structural elements and plating that just makes it feel more distinct and utilitarian and unmistakable from any other part of the ship. You could tell, I think, from just looking at a screenshot of this without any labels that this is an engineering section. The main showpiece though, and arguably one of the best places on the ship, is the main engineering console and its panoramic viewport that looks out onto the engine room. It's a space that feels straight out of a science fiction movie or show, like you might have seen on Star Trek. Paints here are again well used, with white floor plating well contrasting the dark walls and angry red lighting, which of course is offset by the blue glow of the engine room. The space is dynamic and interesting, and I pretty much have no comments about it at all. I think it's, again, one of the most impressive and successful spaces on the whole ship. Traveling down the open lift to the back of the room then takes us down to yet another airlock. I like the separation of spaces with these safety bulkheads and airlocks, by the way, which eventually takes us out onto a lower catwalk that has a phenomenal view of the ship's main reactor and engine. Here we see a much better use of lighting, where dynamic lights are cast through spinning fans to bring a little bit of movement to a static scene, and the caustic lighting coming from the water below also activates the underside of a lot of the geometry of the engine to even embellish it further. The upper catwalk that overlooks the main engine continues the drama with geometry and lighting that work together to embellish structure and mechanicals. I really like this middle section of the engine, by the way, which has these weights that spin around the centerpiece. It's very cool looking, even if it maybe doesn't have any real functionality. I really feel like the engine room feels the most alive of nearly anywhere on the ship. But just off this space at the other end of this room, you'll find another bulkhead, and through it will lead us to our next stop, the cargo bay. Here, the ship team once again demonstrate their further mastery of program adjacencies and relationships with the strategic locating of the cargo hull directly below the hangar bay. This allowed them to design two large cargo lifts that can lift supply up to the hangar above from the cargo room to resupply a ship, or inversely allow any ship boarding the Polaris to resupply the Polaris itself, maybe with more torpedoes. You'll also find that the ship's tractor beam is also located in here and inside the ship, but unfortunately it doesn't enjoy any position that would offer it much usefulness to take stuff from outside the ship and move it in. That, I think, is mostly up to the vehicles and even ships that can fly into the cargo bay once the doors are open. By the way, you can probably fit an Ursa, CRV, Pisces, Merlin, Argo, and Fury, and a ton of other small ships just inside the store if you're careful. It really is a very useful bay in that sense then. The real showpiece of the space, though, is at the end of the room, where up a big, wide elevator capable of lifting size 10s up to this intermediary level, you'll find 4 active size 10 torpedo carousels. Here's where the 28 size 10 torpedoes are housed, and they'll actually rotate as each torpedo is loaded up into the 4 respective tubes. And to access those tubes, you just need to travel a little bit forward into the next room. And it's in this room you'll find an engineering console, but more importantly, the torpedo operator's console. Now, unlike other ships in Star Citizen up until this point, the only way for you to actually operate the torpedoes aboard the Polaris is to enter this room and access this engineering console. From here, you have access to a remote turret, which enables the user to load torpedoes, lock them on, and then send them out to destroy the enemy. The whole room is really dramatic with glass coverings over the tubes so that you can actually see the torpedoes as they're loaded. It's a nice, subtle, but really great touch that makes the space, again, one of the better spaces aboard the ship, certainly better than any of the main corridors above. Just beyond that, you'll find access to the forwardmost big size 6 bespoke turret. Now though, we're going to travel a bit backward past a space we actually didn't stop in, and that's this intermediary space with an elevator in it. This actually takes us down to the surface below if we're landed, but it also takes us all the way directly up to the main corridor, which eventually will lead us to the bridge. But we're not stopping there just yet, we've got a couple more stops to make. A couple of spaces we've not visited yet on this corridor are the 2 top turrets as seen on the exterior, which are accessed through this corridor directly across from each other. A little bit further forward, you'll find an unlabeled door that will eventually be the captain's quarters. This, strangely enough, wasn't included in this initial release and is planned to be released with a future version of Star Citizen, so if you were looking for the captain's quarters, it's not there yet. Yet further forward and across from the lift that we just came up though is the main ship's armory. Here you'll find plenty of room for armor, weapons, and even heavy weapons. And it's pretty well positioned next to the bridge and the crew quarters to give them easy access in the event that the ship's been boarded so that they can get there before the boarders get too far in. The only challenge I have to this design though is whether or not, given the ship's size, if it shouldn't have followed the Idris's lead with an armory officer position and security area to monitor and restrict access. The Polaris is big, but it's not as big as an Idris, so again, it's a debatable change, but I would have looked into maybe trying it to just see if it works. Finally though, it's time for our last stop, the bridge. Passing a series of escape pods reserved for the bridge crew, we arrive at an upper deck to the bridge that has a holographic strategic display, a useful piece of kit for any capital ship that's looking to read the conditions of an engagement and direct other ships, and to detect other ships that might be in the crew's blind spot. But the real action happens yet further down and forward to the main part of the bridge, complete with 4 crew positions and yes, a single center seat for a ship's captain. And I can't tell you how happy I am to see a captain's seat. The space feels distinctly RSI, with that glass canopy and strut supporting it, along with an RSI color scheme. The expression of utilities and structure also help continue to sell that design language that we've seen throughout the entire ship's interior design. Of note are the operator seats, which have a really cool wraparound horizontal MFD display that is functional and works with this version of the game. To go over bridge crew positions, the 2 rear seats are for the remote turret operators, with the left seat operating the rear top missile turret and the right seat operating the bottom rear anti-fighter turret. The forward right position is for the co-pilot, who has control of the flight deck operations, being able to operate the doors, and can even look at a view screen, a remote camera that can look around the flight deck itself to make sure it's clear and see if there's anybody trying to board, a feature that I hope to see on future ships that come into Star Citizen. It also can fly the ship when the pilot seat isn't occupied. The leftmost seat, of course, then is the main ship's helm or pilot seat. And finally, at the center is the captain seat, which also has access to a radar holographic and MFDs attached to the chair to help the commander better understand the situation and give commands. The seat also allows for target designation to inform gunners of target priorities. But then how useful is it actually in game? Well, I'd like to do a full video on this, but as a brief overview, in practice with all positions filled, the Polaris really does demonstrate just how cool Star Citizen can be. The Polaris to me is the first ship in the game that really scratches that Star Trek-esque experience itch, with different crew positions that have meaningful tasks to keep the ship in action. When engineering finally comes online as well, I think the whole experience will be enhanced even further. With the ship's 7 turret positions, one of which is a size 6, and 28 size 10 torpedoes coupled with numerous automated PDCs, the Polaris is a formidable ship and a force to be reckoned with in the current form of the game, even more so when the game progresses further. With capital components, its quantum tanks and shields also make it able to take a punch and travel great distances without refueling. Honestly, the ship's combat capability, though, like I said, really needs a different video, so I'm going to be revisiting this topic when the ship is a little bit more polished. Right now, the turrets don't work with pips, so it's really hard to use in combat, so again, look for that a little bit later on the channel. So wrapping up what's already turned out to be quite a long video, the ship's exterior exceeds all of my expectations for the Polaris, but its interior doesn't really follow that up. I think the corridors and general spaces of the main deck needed a little bit more identity and a bit more polish with that lighting, maybe by introducing some strong blues with accent lighting that could have been used to accentuate structure and detailing and provide contrast to an otherwise pretty well detailed space. I also found a number of examples where there were light casts with no clear light source being modeled, which was a little bit, that just didn't feel as polished as I think it could have been. After that, more contrasting colors like whites, dark grays, and blues could have done the interior geometry a little bit more justice. The concept art as well as the Zeus interior provide some great direction for this, and maybe those can be used to help direct some further adjustments to the interior. And I almost forgot there were no interior windows. Why? A window or two would have been nice, maybe in like the crew area or the habitation area, or certainly in the captain's quarter. That's something I hope that they look into when bringing that into the final version of the ship. In my view then, when examined together, the whole ship design feels a bit conflicted. The ship then, for me, gets a generous B+. Just short of full marks in my mind, but I think it could be brought up with a little bit more polish. But what do you feel like? Do you agree with my feedback? And if there are other things that I didn't say, what did you spot that I didn't? Be sure to let me know down below, and I look forward to a follow-up video when I finally get this ship out and doing some real combat, and when the captain's quarters makes its way in. Hope to see you guys in the next one.